Mike Jordan uses an awful lot of road there at Paddock. He really is trying.
This film is about guilt. Guilt about the fact that I love the motor car. And I love every aspect of the motor car. I like buying them, driving them, owning them, cleaning them. I even do a bit of motor racing.
It's such a late clip, isn't it?
But there's the other me that lopes about and feels guilty. Guilt about using a car at all, when they say what a catastrophic effect it's having on our environment. Guilty about the fact that these great big lumps of metal are such lethal weapons. If it's not killing the planet, then it's killing us. Should I feel guilty?
I suppose I would just like to talk about the basic dichotomy that I have in my life, related to the very great interest that I have in the motor car. Perhaps I should start by asking you quite simply why you think I like the motor car so much.
Well, actually, your relationship to the car is probably extremely complicated, and I think we should best explore this by asking you to go back and to think about your first association with cars.
Well, I do remember on the sports fields at school, and I was hopeless at all games at school. When we were playing rugby, for example, I was always at full back, well out of the action, and I aimed to keep it that way. But I remember roaming around by myself at the back of the field, miming gear changes and steering wheels, and I used to propel myself at great speed up and down the rugby field and round the white line, imagining myself not necessarily on some sort of racetrack, but just in control of myself, controlling my own destiny and maneuvering myself around.
I don't know if the other boys knew what I was doing. I think they just thought I was a bit peculiar, or to coin a phrase of the time, a bit of a spaz.
But certainly the inspiration for at least a lot of my love of cars and machinery in general was the fact that I was brought up on a farm, and farms are wonderful playgrounds. And I remember being, of myself and my two brothers, the person who was always most keen to drive the tractor.
What was great about driving the tractor was that it was my first taste of speed. It just seemed so fast. And yet it wasn't. The tractor's top speed was 18 miles per hour, but the fun that can be had at 18 miles per hour, to me it felt like 150.
But then after the tractor really was, fortuitously, my mother's Morris Minor broke down after only doing 35,000 miles. The wheel into the front wheel arch, quite a common problem on some Morris Minors. And it was dumped on the farm. It was a perfectly good car, except for this one mechanical problem, which no one could be bothered to get round to solve. And I solved it. I managed to find a part.
So this was it, my very first car. I couldn't believe my luck. If a farm is the ultimate playground, then this was the ultimate toy. I had a whale of a time driving recklessly about the farm for a couple of years, and then I decided to indulge in some customization. I was convinced that the fewer body panels there were around me, the cooler I looked. When there was hardly anything left, I felt I was really motoring.
So really what you were doing, I suppose, is you were disfiguring the sort of parental vehicle and trying to transform it into something that was much more to your liking.
Much more me, yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. But how did you sort of move from that kind of driving experience to what most people take to be driving? I mean, passing the test and getting onto the road.
Well, yes, obviously, by the time I was 17, I thought I was a pretty good driver because I'd been herring around a farm with what I thought was pretty immaculate car control for a few years by that point. And I think I probably was a reasonable driver technically, but I wasn't a good enough driver to pass the Department of Transport test because I took my driving test 3 times, failed it twice.
STY751G.
I never failed for a technical reason. The reason stated on the failure form was always the same: not paying due care and attention to other road users. What did they mean? I was sure I was technically competent, but I suppose I just drove in a rather carefree style. I just went about the business of getting from A to B. Perhaps after 2 years on the farm, I treated other road users like wandering sheep that had escaped from the pen.
I think this idea, though, of feeling invincible, that your skills are very sharply honed, I mean, it's very typical. It's very typical from the research of young males. If you ask men in particular, but also women to a large extent, do they think they're a good driver, then something like 85 to 90% think that they are above average. And to some extent, I think people treat being called a bad driver as almost on their sexual ability. People will admit that they're not very good at hanging wallpaper or carpentry. But when it comes to driving, most people feel very confident of those. So your experience at your pre-test is by no means unusual here, I don't think.
So having acquired your driving license, you must now have felt that you were in total control. You'd acquired the mastery you were after as far as cars were concerned.
Yes, yes. I mean, mastery and I suppose the return of my self-esteem was best exemplified a couple of years later when I did take my heavy goods vehicle driving license.
Why I suddenly yearned to drive a truck, I'm not sure. Perhaps I was just remembering those days on the combine harvester, that nice feeling of being in control of something big. Perhaps ship's captains and heads of large industrial companies get the same vibes. It's the challenge of the difficulty of the task that gives you the satisfaction. Whenever I'm asked what the most exciting moment of my life has been so far, the one time outside the field of personal relationships when I can most clearly remember experiencing unadulterated joy was the moment immediately following my HGV Class 1 driving test.
Mr. Atkinson, I'm pleased to say you've passed your test.
The experience of making 2,000 people laugh in a theatre is but a light breeze compared to the tornado of excitement that I felt at that moment in 1981.
So quite clearly, you weren't content to be in control of the average old vehicle that everybody else drives. You wanted something much more grand and powerful.
No, that's right, yes, absolutely. But I think some of it is a sort of a yearning that I have, I suppose, in all areas of my life, which has always been to be different. You know, it's always trying to be the odd, wanting, if you like, in a way, to be the odd man out, to be the one who's doing something that everyone else is not doing. I mean, I know that that's what I liked at school, even though I was hopeless at games, which was obviously the thing that most boys admired other boys for. The one thing I could do, it seemed at the time, was act in the school play, and at least I could do that.
So perhaps we start to get at what Rowan Atkinson's cars are really all about. They're part of that whole alternative, choosing an alternative way of actually achieving something which is very sort of personal and very real and very fulfilling.
Well, yes, but at the same time, I feel within myself that I'm basically, you know, a pretty shy and retiring sort of bloke, and I'm constantly surprised at the way that only in the world, only in relation to cars, that I can do these relatively arrogant things, make these relatively arrogant, brash gestures of buying really rather sharp-looking motor cars that, in theory, you know, there's a big bit of me which says, this is madness, you know, this is not you. I mean, there was this Mercedes 600 that I came across only about 3 or 4 years ago that was at the end of a particularly frantic period of buying and selling cars, and it was this huge, great big long thing. But what was wonderful about it is that, you know, Mercedes engineers had installed this extraordinary air hydraulic system that did absolutely everything. I mean, not only did the seats move backwards and forwards and up and down by air, you got this little sound and things moved. Back it went. You pressed a button and the boot opened. And you pressed the button and the boot closed. It's all. Now, I was fascinated by that, I suppose, as an engineer. But at the same time, I got in it and I bought it. I bought the blasted thing. And I drove 50 yards and I felt such a prat. Such a prat.
What had I done? Surely the owner and driver of that road-going liner couldn't be me. It was the turning point. I realized my passion was out of control.
It probably means that you haven't quite yet found, or hadn't quite found, a car which actually is sort of tuned to the kind of image that you want to project, not only to other people as a piece of self-expression, but actually to yourself. And I think whenever we look at a car, we inescapably have a kind of thumbnail sketch of the kind of person who would ordinarily drive that kind of car. And if we feel that kind of person, then we're attracted towards the car. If we can't see ourselves as a member of that kind of group of persons, then we will reject the car. So perhaps your history is a way of sort of working towards an image that you want other people to have of you, but more importantly, that you want to have of yourself. And when you find the car that you're comfortable in, to some extent, you found it.
So how do you find the car that fits? Your first port of call might be the motor show. Every car on the market under one roof, served up with Brussels sprouts and all the trimmings.
Ladies and gentlemen, trio.
And so yet another tin box is unveiled to the world press. You'd think that as virtually all of us own a remarkably similar-looking tin box, that we would have long ago stopped regarding such a thing as a significant event. Yet it is, because they've spent £400 million making it look subtly different. And here, every manufacturer is trying to convince you that their subtle differences are more subtle than anyone else's. I first came here to the motor show 20 years ago. My parents brought me down from Northumberland as a half-term treat. And like most people, I did not come to see a Fiat or a Ford. I came to see a Ferrari, because I'd never, ever seen one. These cars have an extremely strong image that is carefully cultivated and jealously guarded.
Can I go on to the cab?
Just getting close to you.
But do cars at the lower end of the market have an image? Or are they simply bought and sold like washing machines?
It's fair to say image is vital to all buyers of motor cars. Gone are the days when people bought motor cars to get from A to B. They all do that safely and reliably. The reason people buy cars of all sizes, classes and prices nowadays is it says something about them. It looks good on their drive, and that's the whole part of buying a motor car. But it's not just the looks, of course. It's the most important part about it is the badge. And if the badge is a good badge, and you mentioned Rover, which I obviously would believe is a good badge, and there are one or two others around in the marketplace today, people are prepared to pay extra money to have that badge.
Right.
They put the car keys down on the bar in the pub, and it's got the logo of the manufacturer, and they say, I've got a whatever. And that makes them feel good, and they feel extremely proud about it.
Worshippers come from throughout the land to pay homage at this cathedral to conspicuous consumption, to ogle and to gape, and to give thanks for their continuing ability to conspicuously consume. There are even angels standing by, a heavenly host of them, ready to flutter their wings and to flatter. The reality of car buying for most of us is far removed from the glitz of a motor show. 60% of us buy our cars second-hand. John and Alan run a second-hand car dealership in South London, and they are in no doubt what inspires them to do so.
Well, I mean, it's basically, if you know what you're doing, it's a license to print money.
You think so, right?
We don't know too much about cars, we're not that mechanically minded,
Right,
but we do know there's a profit in a car.
right.
And once you get to that stage, plain sailing.
A lot of people think that at least, 30% of the car buying public, like housewives or people who have no professed interest in cars, don't care what they drive. Would you say that everybody cares to a certain extent?
A lady came into us on Saturday. She was a student, she was 21. She wanted to spend around that £2,000. And I had a G-Reg Skoda, 3 months old. She said, I don't care what I drive. She said, as long as it gets me from A to B. I said, I can sell you a G-Reg Skoda for £2,000. Oh no, well I don't want a Skoda. I don't really want a Skoda. Anything else you got to see?
Can you tell? Can you get an angle on someone the moment they walk up your driveway then?
I would say so, yeah. By and large, we would be 90% correct, I'd say.
In judging them merely from their look?
Yeah.
What we like to do is use it as our watchtower. If they come in and start going through every single car, and they say, well, it's probably a waste of time, that guy. Whereas another person comes in, looks at, say, the Vauxhall Astra, 5-door hatchback, looks at the Escort 5-door hatchback, possibly Sierra 5-door hatchback, then we know he's looking for a 5-door hatchback.
I think
And he's something, you know, a bit of a comedy and something cheap to run, I suppose.
How finicky are people when they're wanting to buy a car? How much about the car do they want to try out, or do they want to experiment with?
Well, John's a particularly good salesman who's selling a car without driving.
Yeah,
How he does it, I don't know, but...
I'd start very few cars.
You will refuse to start very
No, I won't refuse to, but I just don't see that there's any point. Because I'll explain to them that it would be rather silly of me to buy a car that wasn't in very, very good condition in the first instance.
And they believe you?
Well, don't you?
Well, I don't know. Well, yes, actually, to be honest.
I have a particular problem with Porsches. They are a tremendously good and interesting car, and yet I can't bring myself to buy one, simply because I don't wish to associate myself with the kind of people who do. I don't wish these people any ill. I hope they all continue to have happy and successful lives. But I just don't feel I have much in common with them. I therefore can't bring myself to buy the same kind of car. I have similar problems with other vehicles because of the kind of person I feel myself becoming when I climb in. The car must fit, because as soon as you buy a car, you are immediately identified with all the other people who have bought that kind of car. Although Aston Martin had a similarly strong image to Porsche, for some reason I feel happy with it, and therefore with the car.
A lot of people looking at cars like Aston Martins would see them as no more than sort of mere sort of kind of phallic extensions. And I think there's a lot of slightly charlatan amateur psychology which treats the long bonnet as a sort of the kind of penis, and therefore the men who drive them are perhaps trying to sort of prove something about their own virility and so on. I think we take the view that that is rather too simple-minded.
Well, absolutely. That
especially in
completely wrong.
But it also seems to have the sort of curvaceous suppleness, sensuousness, which you associate with female beauty. So the fact that it has both male and female characteristics is perhaps part of the sort of rather enigmatic attraction that it has. And then along with it, of course, you've actually got the components of the internal combustion engine, about which the American poet E. Cummings wrote one of the most erotic poems I've ever read, simply talking about reciprocating pistons and the hydraulics and the fluid and clutches and disc brakes and things like that. It's very easy to get sort of carried away with these kinds of things. So here you are in the sort of kind of rather hermaphroditic kind of object.
For myself, I'm well aware of this joy that can be derived from mechanical devices. Rolls-Royce make the most obvious status symbol, and they know more about driving ambiance than most people. They are very aware of how important it is to make the things that you touch feel good. Merely the way that a knob to control an air vent moves, the coolness of the chrome on your fingertips, and the smooth, lubricated nature of its movement. Even in more popular cars, these tactile qualities and the cozy feel of the cabin are a terribly important part of the driving experience.
Yes, this is a very important aspect of cars, the sense of enclosure. It's almost really womb-like. It really takes us back, I suppose, to that intrauterine experience of security and warmth and coziness. And that comes from this experience of being on one's own. But the other aspect of it, which is equally interesting, is that because people feel inviolate and secure, they tend to handle their cars in ways which are totally out of proportion to their driving skills.
This is Roderick, a minicab driver in central London. He drives in a most extraordinary fashion, which can only reflect this invincibility that some people feel at the wheel of a car.
just call my driving charismatic. Basically, it's...
This car, Roderick, looks as though it's been through the wars a bit.
Well, that's driving in London. I mean, you know, there's some madmen on the road, I tell you.
So how many accident repairs are pending on this car at the moment?
About 9 at the moment. Most of them aren't my fault. Actually, let's go in this lane, then carve them up and turn left. Yeah, don't worry. Other drivers always get out of the way.
Yes, they'll get out of the way. You seem to wave a lot. Do you wave a lot to people?
Oh, yeah. I always wave. I mean, whenever I carve anyone up, I always think, are they going to indicate? Are they going to beg? Visual eye contact. And then, come on, let's go round them.
Do you encourage visual eye contact?
Oh, no. I never look at the other person. I always look at the car. Judge distances, but not judge people.
Tell me, Roderick, you don't seem a very typical taxi driver in terms of your look and your sound.
Oh, well, I used to work at Lloyd's. I had the distinction of being a suspended member of Lloyd's. Basically, I had my own firm of brokers, and I got ripped off by the people that were working for me.
Do you have contretemps with the police?
Oh, regularly.
What do you think is the key to at least staying out of court?
Grovel. Grovel like mad. I love groveling.
Right.
I mean,
do you think you're good at it?
Oh, yes. It reflects in my sex life.
Right.
I love dominant women, too.
All right. It all becomes painfully clear.
I love going round roundabouts.
Yeah,
you never know what
you can...
Well, yeah, I mean, you never know what you're going to sort of come up against next. It's a bit like accidents. You never know when the next one's going to happen.
No, I can imagine.
So you don't mind if I go around this one a few times?
No.
Should we try and make him run? How do you like that?
Do you think the...
Hang on, he was reversing round a roundabout and he yelled at me.
Yes, he was very...
I mean, you know, that's London. That is London for you. I mean, you know...
Do you stop after accidents?
No, never.
You never stop, right?
Well, very rarely anyway. What's the point? I mean, it's only paperwork, and I don't like paperwork. Ever since I was an insurance broker.
Do you think that driving fills an essential hole in your life that could not be filled by anything else or by any other means?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's like being at the screen of a video machine, you know, playing Star Wars, zapping them all.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Although few of us drive like Roderick, most of us share his insensitivity to the dangers of the road. If 30 people are killed in a train crash, it is deemed a national disaster, and yet that represents just 2 days of road accident deaths.
And that's at 36 miles an hour.
This is a Minister of Transport. He's on a visit to the Transport and Road Research Laboratory, where they have made a speciality of driving cars into concrete blocks in order to see what happens. What happens, apparently, is that the car comes off worse than the block. The analysis of this discovery kept them all in jobs here for many years, until someone discovered that cars rarely collide head-on with concrete blocks. So in today's experiment, the car has hit a deformable structure, more representative of another vehicle, and it hasn't hit it head-on.
This looks like a slightly more oblique approach, a slightly more tangential impact, this one, is that right?
That's right. As you can see on the car, only part of the car has really been involved in the impact. And this side of the car, there's very little damage done to it. Certainly not very much energy has been absorbed. This is much more typical of what happens in an accident, where only one side of the front of the car is involved, and all the energy has to be absorbed by the structure here. This brings all the fascia, this very stiff area around the windscreen, towards the occupant. And as he moves forward in his seatbelt, then he's much more likely to hit this. and receive serious injuries or fatal injuries. I think the car manufacturers have had the dilemma that they don't want to indicate when somebody comes to buy a new car that this might be the vehicle that they have an accident in. So I think that they are anxious to try and play down safety in that way. But if the public question safety when they go to buy a car, then car manufacturers will respond and will give increased safety. It's within their capability.
Paul Catlin is an ex-traffic policeman who, having spent many years pulling mangled bodies from the wreckage of cars, decided that lives could be saved and indeed a living could be made from teaching people to drive more safely.
So, in terms of concentration, how much, in your reckoning, do drivers concentrate? I mean, they don't...
If I'm being generous?
Yes, absolutely.
If I'm being very generous, I should imagine out of an hour's journey, they're probably concentrating for 15 minutes of it, which works out about 25%. We've all been on the familiar journey, and we've turned up at work, and you know you're at work. You haven't got a clue how the hell you got there.
Right, yes, that's true, yeah.
And in fact, it's probably Sunday and you realise you shouldn't even be at work.
Right.
You should have been going to get a paper. So 25%, I think, that represents probably, out of 4 cars coming the other way, 3 of them don't even know you're there. Doesn't matter whether they're doing the right things with the steering wheel.
And why aren't they thinking about driving? Why aren't they concentrating?
The car's easy to drive, and manufacturers have made it easier and easier and easier, and it's become a safer and safer environment for when we have the crash.
Right.
Seatbelts are here. It's a quiet car, it's a comfortable car, it's an extension of your home.
Right, but you can't see them changing that, surely?
No, because we, the public, have demanded it.
So, do you think I'm concentrating sufficiently to
No, you're
drive
talking
safely?
to me.
Well,
but
yes,
I think what you're doing is what most people do, and that's you fall into the trap of you're still a pedestrian whilst you're driving.
Ah, right.
There's a pedestrian here, and look how far ahead he's looking. He's probably just looking about 2 feet in front of him.
Right.
Now, we're designed as pedestrians. We were never designed to be car drivers.
Right.
If we imagine that when we run, we look a little bit further ahead, that's what you're doing as a car driver. You're probably looking to a maximum, I would say, of probably the length of a cricket field and the width of it, when we suffer from what we call tunnel vision, which is why you're making fairly late movements for a car that's on the left that we should have seen half an hour earlier. Shall I actually do a commentary of what we should be seeing?
Right.
One thing we try and do is try and get eye contact with people. As I said, 3 out of 4 people don't really see us, so I've got to do everything I can to try to get them to see us. If I position my car nice and early, it tells the cavalier coming through the other way that I really would like this section of road. However, I would be willing to give it up should it go wrong.
Right.
Because it's not aggressive driving. I'm trying to be a little bit more assertive, though. There's a difference. Yeah, the difference between being positive and negative, isn't it? This person's trying to look for a parking space. We've got a couple of members of Exit trying to cross over the road here, trying to commit suicide. We've got a car almost waiting to turn right here. If you ever sit like that, by the way, you're in a dangerous position. The wheels are turned at an angle, and if she got hit from the rear, she get pushed into oncoming traffic. Again, we're warned of a roundabout sign. We're still thinking about this vehicle ahead of us, the fact that it wants to turn. Now, a lot of drivers would get very, very close to this driver and treat them as something in the way they've got to get rid of. Right. That increases your stress level. If you sit back, she's going to turn right and go all the way back into the same probably. She hasn't found a parking space. Right. Probably when she turns, it's going to be a he, and I've actually not been very good at observation. Right. Bring my speed down, anyway.
No, you're right. It was as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, what I'm trying to do, actually, is keep my heart rate and blood level actually level on a par. Normally, when we drive, it's up and down, and we're heading for our first heart attack. At the end of the day, this is much more dangerous driving here, and I think a lot more interesting than perhaps driving around a racetrack.
There's no doubt that on a racetrack, you're far more likely to have an accident than on the road. But having had an accident, you're far more likely to be unhurt. You're sitting there, strapped in like a fighter pilot, wearing a crash helmet, fireproof overalls, fireproof socks, fireproof underwear, in a car with a big roll cage welded into it, more than double or triple the strength of its structure. All the traffic is going the same way, like a big one-way street. And above all, everyone is concentrating. Very, very hard indeed. do have a spill, there's always an ambulance in sight. You couldn't come off a country road at night and have men dressed in orange running up to you with fire extinguishers. In everyday driving, your car is just as much a lethal weapon, and yet everything conspires to distract you from wielding it safely.
Yeah. Peter, hi. Yep.
Modern cars are so stiff with home comforts, we often forget that we're not at home.
Just hang on a moment, would you? Just hang on. Yep. Well, it should be about 2:30.
We put a ridiculous amount of trust in the one gesture that we are forced by law to make to safety, the wearing of a seatbelt.
I think most people would agree that certainly in the first couple of years after the introduction of the law making it compulsory, there was a fairly sharp increase in minor collisions, consistent with people feeling so safe they weren't taking so much care. Because they got the seatbelts on, of course, they weren't seriously injured. This links very directly to what's actually technically known as risk homeostasis, that we all try and balance the sense of excitement that we have. So the more safe you make people feel, they'll act in such a way to bring their sort of experience back up to a level that they feel comfortable with.
You mean they'll drive faster?
Faster indeed. So if you put somebody in a very big, solid car, let's take a Volvo, these kind of rather tank-like objects where you do feel very invulnerable, then as a consequence of that, you're likely to drive them faster, you're likely to pay less attention to the roads than you did before until you're back to square one. The same happens if we make roads straighter and faster because there's no sensation of risk coming from that experience. We compensate by putting that back in.
Certainly I know for myself that I get little sensation of risk travelling at 70 miles per hour on a motorway. Indeed, my brain is dead. Surely this is a dangerous state of affairs.
You know, when the speed limits were set many, many years ago for motorways, they were set at 70. Yet we have the same speed limits on motorways that we have on our dual carriageways, where you have roundabouts, traffic lights, old ladies crossing the road. So that really doesn't make sense to the average motorist. And that's why we in the police service do advocate a higher speed limit. Cars are now built to go much faster than they were years ago. The roads are much safer. Therefore, we think that the speed limit can be higher.
Do you think a lot of people perhaps seek to be chased, to be involved in a pursuit?
Yeah, there's some evidence of that, actually. Certainly in the case of car thieves and people who take cars without the consent of the owner, that they actually lurk about waiting to be picked up by a police officer. And we had a very interesting case very recently in Warwickshire where we had a BMW vehicle stolen, and it was being tracked by my Jaguar cars on the motorway, on the M6, and at one time, at 120 miles an hour, the driver put his fingers up through the roof to the cars that were following him, and he actually telephoned his girlfriend in London to say that he was on his way, but unfortunately he was being followed by a couple of police cars, and directly he could shake them off, he would get off them. But we had to take a decision, so we decided on a very rarely used technique of boxing him in. In the initial stages, we used a member of the public as the front man in the box, and he lost his bottle at the last moment, and the BMW temporarily got away. But very quickly, we had him boxed in with all police cars on this occasion, and we were able, with the use of skillful police drivers, to stop the thief in his car without any great damage to the vehicle.
This chap certainly got his comeuppance and is now serving time at Her Majesty's pleasure. But what brings about this change of character that makes ordinary men and women behave so irresponsibly at the wheel of a motor car?
Cars are, in a very real sense, an extension of our bodies. And we treat people who violate the space of our cars just as we would those who violate the space of our bodies. And this territorial component is an important clue to why people behave in such an extreme fashion when they're driving. So, for example, we don't like people coming up close behind us and leaning over our shoulder, just as we don't like cars tailgating us and driving up close behind. But cars are, of course, a great leveler. They equalize in a sense that they allow people to pit themselves against each other, not personally, but through the medium of the car.
The traffic lights scenario is a common one. You have someone alongside you, and both parties feel the proximity of the other, feel a slight invasion of their spaces, and are rather keen to get away. The slightest movement in the car next to you can bring a tiny, involuntary movement of your own foot off the brake. And if the other person reacts in a similar way, then suddenly the fight is on. This is one of the most dangerous aspects of modern motoring. Mature adults behaving like children. Well, not even like children, like animals. Absurd territorial bickering, like two otters trying to shove each other off a tuft of grass. Perhaps it's because of the antiseptic nature of modern society, where we don't have to defend our homes against marauding hordes, that we turn to the motor car to provide our thrills and danger. Of course, when conflicts like this were commonplace, in more primitive times, retribution was swift.
Driving the car, in a sense, you become kings of the road. You can escape. You've got nobody telling you to slow down or do this or do that. And I think that's part of the magic of that whole experience.
Do you mean that there isn't much danger in modern life, and that you can experience a thrill, a danger?
Certainly, driving a car is often one of the few opportunities that we have for risk-taking, and again, that's why it's exciting. But this getting away from having somebody telling you what to do, and that's why I think a lot of people, I don't know whether it applies to you, enjoy most being on their own in the car rather than having passengers. Certainly I feel that.
Yes, that is true, yes. I do prefer to be on my own.
So this is what it's all about. The freedom of the open road. And above all, the self-determination. When you drive down the end of your road on a Sunday morning, you could turn left, go down the shop, and buy a paper. Or you could turn right and drive to Edinburgh for lunch. You don't, but the great feeling is that you could. And it is the removal of this freedom that frustrates us so much. Suddenly we are restricted. Suddenly we can't go where we want, when we want. All we can do is follow like sheep. And hence the overpowering desire to get away, to get out. Even if you don't know a shortcut, at least you're moving. An element of self-determination is returned to us. We may not know where we're going, but at least we're going somewhere. So often the shortcut is a long cut, and we are not even any further forward. But usually we don't care. We've used petrol, tired ourselves out, but in a way it was worth it. We escaped, and although we were recaptured, it's always good to taste freedom. Millions of us subject ourselves to this maddening crawl every day rather than travel by public transport. Why?
I think because the car is this kind of personal turf, we have at least the illusion of having total mastery and control over our own kind of destiny. We can actually choose to stop. We can behave in ways in a car that we wouldn't dream of doing, or most of us wouldn't dream of doing on buses, you know, picking our noses, farting, scratching, having sex, eating, all those kinds of things, which most people, by and large, don't do on trains. We're not going to get people out of their cars simply because we have efficient buses or efficient trains, for all of the kind of deep, ingrained psychological reasons that are associated with the experience of driving. Maybe if we had good public transport and we had Stalin in power, we could actually stop people driving, but I think it's going to take such draconian steps to sort of get rid of this love affair with the car that there is not the political strength or political will for any government to achieve that. Any government which starts to sort of interfere with this apparently God-given right to drive on the roads at any time and anywhere you want, anybody who puts that in their manifesto is going to be in political oblivion for a very long while, I think.
It seems to me there are two ways of affecting the behavior or the abilities of the motorist. One is to regulate and to make it more difficult to have cars depending on their size or more expensive, or to introduce tests like the emissions test. And the other is the price mechanism. Those matters, though, are for the Chancellor.
There's no doubt that the motor car is a political hot potato. The government are reluctant to do anything that might affect our freedom or our standard of living. And the motor manufacturers only do what the customer demands. But really, I need the government to legislate. Because what am I going to demand when I'm enjoying something so much?
Most people's idea of the car is of one person driving in it to freedom over a Scottish moor. But this is the reality of the motor trade. 35 million new cars are made every year. That's 100,000 cars a day, or one car every second. You sneeze and 5 new cars come into the world. You go to bed at night and you wake up and there are an extra 30,000 cars on the road. The motor trade is a huge, enormous, growing organisation. It's got nothing to do with the way that it's marketed. And there are serious environmental consequences as a result.
There has always been personal transport. Today it is the motor car. It could be the personal rocket ship in 20, 30, 40 years' time, who knows. But whilst the freedom of mobility is required by the consumer, and it has to be, that's why he's buying all these cars around the world, then I believe that the motor car in whatever guise will continue. So I'm extremely optimistic about the future of the motor car. And let me give you one interesting example. It's what's happening in Eastern Europe at the moment, where they have been given liberty, freedom for the first time in many years as we perceive it in the West. So I don't know if they perceive it quite the same way. Right. And the very first thing they've done is go out and buy thousands of motor cars.
But one man's meat, of course, is another man's poison.
These manufacturers are currently eyeing up Eastern Europe. They're already building factories in Bulgaria, Yugoslavia and Hungary. And after that, they'll be looking at the third world. They're already moving into Latin America. And most of the car market, huge though it is currently devoted to North America, Europe and Japan. And when that rate of growth expands to the rest of the world, then the impacts on the greenhouse effect, for example, will be huge.
So, do you think that the car will simply have to cease to exist?
Yes, I think that's about right. I mean, the end of the road is nigh for the motor car. We don't realise it at the moment. It sounds like a completely lunatic thing to say, but I think that this decade will be the turning point in the success of the motor car. I mean, if it doesn't happen, then we're all going to go down the toilet, because there is no way that we can maintain this level of growth in air pollution from motor vehicles.
Yet again, the problem is one of perception. Where is this hole in the ozone layer? And assuming that someone with sharper eyes than me has spotted it, what on earth can we do about it?
Imagine a vehicle that can drive you 5 miles for a penny. A vehicle that needs no petrol, just a battery. And that takes the press of a button to start, the squeeze of a lever to stop. The Sinclair C5, £399. Want to buy one? Want to see one? Or simply want to read all about it?
The bottom line is people don't like the idea of driving an electrical car. And the reason for this is that electricity is associated with domestic appliances and with the kitchen. So whenever people are offered the prospect, as they were in the case of Clive Sinclair's C5, of having an electrically powered vehicle, their minds unconsciously go back to the whole idea of hoovers, sewing machines, refrigerators, all these kinds of things which are associated with menial work and not with the kind of liberation that the car should bring.
And it is a very real liberation that in the end overrides my guilt. I have nightmares about the petrol running out, about empty roads and a lack of independence. And yet secretly, I'm optimistic. optimistic that there'll always be personal transport, and that it will always be possible to make it exciting.
Próxima atração na